Welcome to a panel that kind of focuses a bit on what we were looking at in the last panel, where we were mentioning the fact that we have a ton of different chains, a ton of different rollups, different networks, and all of these different networks have different types of properties that might make them good to use or bad to use. But one thing that they do cause is very bad UX for the user. So I'll point that a little bit. Before we go in to sort of talk about that, I think we have some pretty big experts, particularly in the chain abstraction space. So if you could give a quick intro who you are, what you're working on, and just spice it a little bit, maybe give us one example of terrible UX caused by different chains. Let's start on the right side.
Sure, yeah, so quick intro is my name is Tabasco, my real name is Ethan. I lead developer relations at Particle Network. The kind of brief TLDR on Particle is that we do account level chain abstraction, so we essentially have smart accounts called universal accounts that allow you to have one balance that spans across all blockchains. You can essentially use applications without needing to do manual bridging or managing multiple wallets and things like this through means of account abstraction through universal accounts. So this is essentially what we're building at Particle, and we've been kind of building in the chain abstraction space for quite a while now. Primarily for the reason that multi-chain UX is fundamentally growing in a lot of ways. We expect a lot from end users, primarily in terms of what they're expected to do cognitively. So whenever a user, for example, is using application A on chain A, and they want to use application B on chain B, this requires two things from them. Number one is that they need to bridge their balances from chain A to chain B. This is a fundamentally difficult task to do all the time, and it requires multiple steps, multiple rules, etc. for end users. And not only this, once they bridge their funds, typically we now expect them to cognitively manage two different balances on these chains. And now this only extends across every X amount of chains that you want to include here. And because as an ecosystem we're moving towards this rollup-centric future, and we're ideally in the future going to have 10,000 rollups and 10,000 applications, this is a huge kind of like burden that we're putting on our users. So when it comes to multi-chain UX, from my perspective, really the number one thing is what we expect cognitively from end users to manage multiple chains and multiple balances.
Perfect, thank you. And there's no Stefan, so we'll go to Rishabh.
Hey guys, I'm Rishabh. I'm one of the founders of Socket. Socket is the first chain abstraction protocol. So we leverage something called MOFA, Modular Order Flow Auctions, to achieve chain abstraction. The key idea is basically it's too complex for users to kind of like interact directly with chains in like a world of 100 chains, right? So we essentially want to create this global block space view in some sense for users, where users just interact with this global paradigm, but all the actual on-chain execution can basically be outsourced or outsourced to these off-chain agents, right? And they can kind of like act as specialized actors to take care of everything for users on-chain, so users never have to interact with chains directly. In terms of like the horrible multi-chain UX, like I think whenever I open my wallet, it gives me a headache to see my USDC on 10 different chains and my ETH on 10 different chains, and that's that's where the problem starts, and it goes much deeper.
And Jim.
Hello everyone. Bit of an echo, sorry. I'm Jim. Maybe this works. I'm Jim. I'm one of the co-founders of a cross-chain liquidity protocol called Catalyst. What Catalyst is it's effectively a scalable cross-chain liquidity layer that is built for the scale of millions of chains. And I do not stutter, I mean millions. And so when we see the absolute Cambium explosion of chains that I think are going to be seeing in the next 24 months to 48 months, Catalyst will be built for that scale. And the way we do that is that we optimize the protocol to be lightweight and extensible enough to effectively be deployed on chains within seconds. And so once we then kind of hit this inflection point where all the infra is ready and all kind of the chain abstraction infrastructure and projects are ready, Catalyst is kind of the liquidity rails that are going to be able to facilitate the expansion and connection of all these new chains, such that it can be exposed to protocols like Socket, to Bungee, and ultimately to the end user experience. I would say a really bad UX that I see, I'm going to give two. I'm cheating a little bit. But the first one is actually a piece that maybe not a lot of users realize, but actually is pretty salient once you build on a multi-chain scale for developers. And that is that every rollup and every chain is just somewhat different, slightly, To an extent where it's actually really difficult to be deploying them kind of just like willy-nilly, right? And so at Catalyst, we pride ourselves on being able to deploy into a lot of different chains. And so when we expand different chains and we see things like, really, really small block times that ultimately kind of run off course or become kind of tilted from the indexer speeds, or we see rollups that have completely different like block sizes and gas limits, that kind of like forces us to build more generalized and forces us to build more scalable such that we can appease those, but it's really annoying for us to be able to expand those different chains. I think when users think about, oh, why can't I just have different apps that are available on all these different chains, that's precisely the reason. And I was supposed to give a second one, but I forgot it, so
we'll get to the second one later. I think I might know what you're thinking of. Richard?
Hey everyone, my name is Richard. I'm one of the co-founders of Orb Labs. And we're building a chain abstraction provider. You can think of a chain abstraction provider as a new category of middleware that sits between the wallets, apps, and the chains. And sort of like facilitates and orchestrates almost all the complexity that comes with sort of like building crypto infrastructure. It could be cross-chain stuff, it could be the emergent landscape around private transactions. It can be basically almost any form of complexity that exists in the crypto space, within the middleware side of things. It just takes on that responsibility of figuring things out. So developers and application, a lot of developers and application builders can simply just send transactions or send sort of API calls as they would with any other system and just enjoy the benefits of whatever new complicated infrastructure that's coming out there. In terms of bad UX, or I guess problems that come with cross-chain stuff, I think the biggest one that is not a customer-facing problem is actually running off-chain infrastructure. So Oracle relayers, whatever you have. Just to give you a quick sort of like rundown of the problem. For all these sort of like different off-chain infrastructure, pingers, call it Oracle or whatever, there's this sort of like amount of work you have to do on just making sure you have enough gas on all the chains to sort of like consistently send information anywhere you can send that information to. And once you start dealing with like more than maybe a dozen different chains, you start to realize that managing gas for a bunch of arbitrary accounts actually sucks. Because anytime, like almost every few days or something, one of them is going to run out of money. You have to go figure out how you're going to move the money around, the best ways to sort of like get assets to go to random chains to sort of like keep things going. And if you forget or you miss things that are happening in the middle of the night, you're looking at your protocol or whatever going silent for maybe a couple of hours, which is sort of like terrible customer UX. So yeah, there's a lot of work that sort of like comes with just running simple off-chain infrastructure once we have this multi-chain.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate the intro. I just realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mass, research partner at Name11, and I like infrastructure. I like chain abstraction. So we kind of touched on it a little bit here, Jim. The differences that come with different networks. I think let's maybe go a little bit deeper into this, and then we can go into sort of how we start to fix some of these issues. So what we see often, I think one clear one, is the fact that the trust assumptions are different, the VMs are different, the block terms are different, as you mentioned. How do we deal with this? And it's something that we can deal with in a way that makes it smoother for the end user.
Yeah, I guess you start that front. So I don't actually think it's possible to get rid of these complexities at the chain level. The reason being, you're not going to get every chain builder to build using the exact same sort of like, just the exact same sort of configurations. People are going to build with certain design purposes in mind. That being said, that doesn't mean that these sort of complexities need to be tossed onto the end user. The ideal state it would be some sort of like provider in the middle taking on that responsibility. And that would work for a lot of consumer-facing sort of like transactions and applications. Maybe not so much for developer applications, simply because developers have other stringent requirements that they need to make. And so I think there's always going to be this level of complexity that comes with building in this multi-chain world that most developers are going to have to sort of take on their own. And if they don't want to, then they're going to have to settle for any sort of like middleware infrastructure that exists for customers and sort of like operate through that. And yeah, going back to even the chain abstraction provider we're building, for the most part, we built most of this with the thought process in mind that we're going to take on most of the challenges that come with interacting with these chains for the end user. But also, if you're a developer, you want to do most of the stuff that sort of typically bothers developers when it comes to cross-chain experiences. A good example being what I mentioned earlier with the oracles and relayers. The chain abstraction provider does help. It does take on the responsibility as well. So yeah, there's a limit to what we can do when it comes to taking away easily lessons and differences. But ultimately, someone's going to have to bear responsibility.
Anything to add to this, Jim, yourself, or
I can take it. It's hard. I think the first step is recognizing that it's hard, and I think it's going to get harder. And I actually welcome that it gets harder because, and this is kind of a hot take, but I like giving hot takes. I think general purpose rollups or general purpose chains, I think we have enough of them, right? And thank you. And maybe there'll be more to come. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I think we have enough. And so I would invite chain builders and rollup builders to take the existing tools that we have and actually customize them for their specific needs, right? And so the design space is only going to get more colorful, and the topology is only going to get more kind of diverse. And I think that's a challenge that myself and my team welcome, right? And with that kind of challenge, you have to design infrastructure and design protocols that are general enough in order to thread that very, very thin needle between all of them. Right, there's a very, very thin overlap of a Venn diagram of 1 million circles, and you need to be designing in that space. And I feel like that is a problem that my team gets really excited about. With that said, I do think that there's going to be more standards over time that are going to allow this to be the little thread, little Venn diagram overlap to be slightly bigger than probably is right now. With things like Polygon and Ag Layer, with things like just general standards that we see within rollup ecosystems, like OP Stack, like Arbitrum Orbit, and so. Hard, but hopefully will be a little bit easier given the kind of convergence that we're seeing with some of these stacks.
So just one more standard to fix all the other standards we have already. There's one meme about having 15 standards. Some guys say, let's have one more standard. Is it just that easy? Do we just need one more standard? What happened to all the other 15 standards we had already? IBC being one, for example. So maybe we can touch a little bit on this, Vishal, but also like to hear your view on if we go for like a one balance type thing, it's easier just to trust USDC, Circle, everybody just use USDC, we can trust that they will settle it eventually and it's just the same thing everywhere. Because there's always different trust assumptions from one rollup to the other or one chain to the next.
Yeah, I think overall what we're seeing is, and this also ties back to your earlier question, right? I'll just rephrase the problem in some ways, right? Like, what's really happening is as these number of chains are increasing, the number of variables that a user needs to keep in mind are increasing exponentially, right? RPCs is a variable, the gas token is a variable, right? Cost is some of, like, even if I want like some other token on another chain, the number of variables are like, the cost is like just included in like 3 components, right? I have the gas cost on source chain, gas cost on destination chain, the cost of bridging, the latency is finality on one chain, finality on other chain, the bridging finality, and so on and so forth, right? So the whole problem that we need to kind of like redefine or solve for is how do we let users interact in this global paradigm of sorts with only the variables that they care the most about, right? Security or trust assumptions could be one variable that they care the most about, and then, or speed or cost or whatever that is, right? And then give them full transparency to control those variables, right? Like if cost is a variable, just give them like one cost. Okay, like just choose whatever you want, right? Like of all these options, right? Or latency or security. So trusting on CCTP or trusting on like maybe IPC, all of these is just like a variable for me that we need to or not need to expose for the user, right? And that is an application level choice that choice kind of like remains between application and the user, where apps can kind of like choose to show whatever they want, and users should be able to select or use whatever app they're comfortable to use with that transparency in mind.
Anything to add to this, Sebastian?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really interesting conversation, just the idea of how do you manage trust assumptions in a chain abstracted world where, like, a big part of LEC UX vision that a lot of chain abstraction projects, including ourselves, have been kind of pushing is that users shouldn't have to know what chain they're using, but there's a lot of issues that are attached to this idea, because if users have no idea what chain they're using, then how do they know what assumptions are attaching to chain? What if they're using a chain that is inherently not secure? And I think there was some tweet about this from, I think it was somebody from Delphi. They mentioned that they want to know what chain they're using. They don't want that to be hidden from them. And this makes sense because there's a lot of trust assumptions that you're trusting a lot of different entities whenever you remove this whole variable of really understanding the chains of the infrastructure that you're interacting with and making it a purely invisible experience. So like, I don't know if there's necessarily one right answer to this. I think that it's, I would say personally, it's probably a per user basis. So some users will need to be invisible because anything more than that will be too confusing or the barrier to entry will be too high. For some users, they'll want to know exactly what chains they're interacting with, what infrastructure they're interacting with, and what these trust assumptions are. We actually had a live stream with VC from Socket as well as a number of other projects last week about this. And I believe it was VC and a few other people that said that maybe we're going to have some easy way to express to users what the risk of the kind of routes that they're using are. And then even Arjun from Everclear, you mentioned that when we're kind of moving towards this intent-centric architecture, solvers are actually incentivized to make more secure choices, which means that the general trust assumptions and security assumptions are a little bit less for users. So he even has made the argument sometime, as well as a number of other projects, that security might even be better for users because instead of requiring or having users handle this themselves, which historically has resulted in a lot of issues for end users, you're actually trusting this to solvers and to more sophisticated entities that can make better decisions sometimes. So there's a lot of moving angles to this problem. I think that at Particle we typically move towards more of the invisibility angle where we want to make sure that the user can have as simple and as removed an experience as possible. But it is true that at the same time this introduces a lot of moving parts that are difficult to handle, especially when it comes to trust assumptions.
Makes a lot of sense. I also think you pivoted it into where we're like to take the conversation next. So you mentioned particularly intents and solvers. And I think everybody on the panel here is doing something with intents, something with solvers, to some extent at least. So we'd love to hear your view on how this fits in. What are these new actors? What kind of trust assumptions are we giving away to them? Is it actually more secure? Or do we just have one citadel running around solving every single chain abstraction intent that people have? Maybe you want to start here, Richard?
Yeah, I can take that. I think I speak more so from our sort of thought process when we were building our intent protocol. So a very core idea for us was always like, how do we satisfy these preconditions that exist for any arbitrary transaction, right? So for the most part, our system functions from the perspective of identifying various states that need to exist on chain for things to work. And in terms of risks that users are taking on, your general user isn't taking on that much risk. You only take on risk for a brief moment where your intent hasn't been solved by the solver. After that, all that risk is taken on by the solver. And I do think this model is just fundamentally better for the end user. The end user is never going to be sophisticated enough to know all the sort of like intricacies about every existing protocol out there. It just makes more sense to give it to someone who has a monetary incentive for doing so, which in this case is a solver. Solver is just better equipped at this. And so I think in the long term, intent protocols and solvers will end up displacing a lot of other protocols for very small transactions. Small transactions are almost guaranteed simply because it just makes more sense. The risk factor is low. There are a lot more people who are capable of solving these transactions. I think as you start dealing with bigger transactions, it's not entirely clear if solvers are going to end up being the final choice. Reason being, there's always going to be some amount of risk that no reasonable sort of like solver is willing to take on without compromising user experience. And yeah, I think that's the big thing. It's always going to come down to risk and sort of like what's the trade-offs for that. I think right now the system works really well for solvers when it comes to very small transactions. Whether that becomes the case indefinitely or not is outside the sort of choice of the solvers. It more so becomes a chain problem. I think if chains become less risky, less rewards, they're better pre-confirmation systems, then absolutely solvers will keep on taking on any amount of risk they can take on to sort of like make money. But there's a cap-off that is, again, tethered to the security factor of the chains. And yeah, it's only a matter of time to figure that out.
Good point on the solver taking on the risk. Anything to add to the intent of the solving space that Collector seems to be mentioning?
I just want to take a second to kind of laugh at how last year all we could talk about were intents. and this year, all we can talk about are solvers, which is great. And it shows that we build these systems and these stacks with a lot of different pieces, and we can slowly, as a collective, like scrutinize the different pieces of it and the trust assumptions for it. On the piece on, so all that to be said, I'm not going to talk about intents right now. So on the piece on solvers, I agree with Richard that it is a drastically better user experience and security guarantees than exposing users to all this complexity. I think we just spent the past 15 or 20 minutes or so talking about the complexities of chains, the trust assumptions, the idiosyncrasies. That is not something that the user needs to care about, right? In fact, there was a bit of controversy last year where Layer 0 actually exposes a lot of that nuance to end users, and they end up just trusting whatever the app does, right? Or trusting the default security assumptions, which is bad behavior, but kind of what you figure an end user would do, right? They're kind of trying to do other things outside of assessing if they're going to get rugged or not. And so having this intermediary entity, this agent, is really helpful. I think where the scrutiny comes in is that assigning this middleman agent is not the silver bullet, right? I think we need to dive deeper into what are the mechanisms that we're building and what are the incentives in place to ensure that it's not just, I think you said, Citadel being the little puppet master of all of this decentralized crypto stuff, right? It's actually a meritocratic and decentralized and open network for other agents to participate in solving these intents, right? And so that comes from having actual tooling that we can give these solvers such that they can actually derive economic benefit from solving these intents, right? I think like every builder in the space would love if a mechanism is designed and 20 solvers come so that they can fight each other for 1 cent, right? Even though they're spending maybe 10, 20, $50 per transaction to source liquidity from centralized exchanges or take on all this risk, right? But that's just not going to be the case, right? And so we need to design systems that ensures that a lot of solvers can participate, but I'm going down a rabbit hole, I'm just going to pause here.
No, it's good that you mention it, because there's obviously, I think, incentivization issues with these solvers, where they might not make much money, or are completely reliant on native tokens being given to them. And that's really not a very good sort of economic model when you're doing these auctions where you want to have best execution. Maybe to take the conversation a little bit differently. Is there a world where we don't need solvers, where the chain abstraction happens on a different level of the stack? I'm seeing a lot of the things where we have a solver might be where chain abstraction is on a wallet level, we put a solve API, or on that level. Is there a world where we get chain abstraction on a protocol level, where all the chains have this one standard we mentioned before, but we might not need to have solvers, or are we just in a world where chains are so different that we are forced to utilize these solvers? Trying to take from there. So.
Yeah, I think chain abstraction is like something sort of a vertical problem in some sense, right? Like where every part of the stack needs to kind of like come together in some shape and form. Right from, let's say, the protocols to the settlement or the proving side of things, right? Like so the IBCs of the world and whatnot, to solvers, to everyone, right? I think, I don't think like there is like a silver bullet at any one part of the stack where we get chain abstraction and everything is solved for. Wallets, so for example, like account abstraction had to solve for like a lot of the complexities at our account front, right? But that has not taken off because it also needs adoption at an interface level, basically, right? And which is like a big blocker, right? Like so, that's something that we'll see, I think, in this sort of a paradigm as well, where all the stack and everything will be chain abstraction optimized for, rather than any one specific part.
Yeah, I think that like the way that and it's a good question, Mo. I think that like so at Particle we kind of introduced or expressed a big part of this chain abstraction problem in the means of a stack of kind of like 3 levels of solutions. So at the highest part of the stack we looked at blockchain level chain abstraction, so really just core interoperability. So for example, composability like NodeKit or Aculator for like providing variation and stuff like this. For like intrinsic interoperability and kind of like composability between protocols and chains, this is really important. I think actually chain abstraction benefits significantly from having this. You don't necessarily need like one standard, I would say. I think that just having this in general between protocols is important. Below this, you have account level chain abstraction. So this is where you see most intent systems. This is even a particle we use an intent-like system. And so this is more like basic targeting user accounts and like the actual like general means of interaction. Or labs, there's a lot of stuff in this area with like Mobiange and stuff like this. And then below this, you have application level chain abstraction, which is more like SDKs and APIs for developers to compose across chains like this. Solver systems as well. So I think really the account level and the application level section are very commonly very intertwined with intent and solver systems. Not to say that it's always the case. I think there is some degree of like misconception that like all chain abstraction is intents. You have projects like Near, for example, which they don't really use intents. They use kind of this like signature aggregation idea, which is kind of separate. I think there's a lot of nuances to that as well. But I think you really need like this, exactly as I said, this vertical stack of solutions, starting really at the interoperability and composability level, and then kind of going down from there, and then relying on intent systems more than the user facing in the application level. So I think that without this, you have an incomplete stack. And I believe it was also Everclear who said this, which is like chain abstraction is modular, and the way that we achieve chain abstraction should be akin to really the modular vertical itself, which is ultimately like modularity is and as a vertical is exactly that. It's a vertical stack of solutions that each contribute to a slightly different part of the problem. And chain abstraction needs to be exactly this to really achieve what is a very ambitious vision of this kind of UX-centric feature.
Thanks for that. And that's the kind of touch a little bit on the protocol level here. I would love to hear about your views on how do I, let's say I'm an application developer, how do I deal with all this choice? And how do I choose what kind of things to go with? How do I ensure that it's safe? And what kind of things do I need to keep in mind when I'm dealing with sort of a multi-chain world where I would like to have my application sit on 10, 15, 20 different types of networks? Do you want to go first, Jim? Or would you?
I can go first. Basically what we have been saying is, there's a lot of complexity that needs to, there's some kind of participant within the flow, the chain abstraction flow, that needs to take on some of that complexity, right? Whether it's the solver or whether it's the app developer, and potentially the user, certainly not my first choice. And as we discussed also, like, there's going to be more complexity, right? And so I think ultimately, like, it's a spectrum, right? And it ultimately comes down to what kind of like app developer persona we're building for. And so if it's an app developer that is, just trying to get the job done, right? Let's say it's like a hackathon project. They're probably going to offload a lot of complexity to like the solver layer, right? And so what that looks like is effectively like either, default settings. There's a number of kind of trust assumptions or a number of, parameters configured that are just kind of like, table stakes good enough for vast majority of use cases, and that's fine. And the other end of the spectrum, it's an application developer that is probably doing something much more, sensitive and needs that level of expressivity from the like security assumption or from the complexity kind of parameter adjustment perspective, right? And so, like, even though it's a spectrum, I think there's probably like discrete chunks in which we can like mark those, right? Because if you say things are spectrums are infinite, and then it gets more complex and people just get confused and ultimately just use the default settings, which we don't want, right? And so ultimately it looks like marking out personas and having essentially like recipes that kind of follow that, right? And it's akin to like, for folks in the audience, like going on Notion, right? Or going on Zapier. Like you go on and it's basically anything for anything, right? It's like, and I like the AI function, and so it's like even more complicated. And so you don't really know what to do, but there's all these recipes that you can see. You're like, oh, I can make like a database. For Zapier, I can make an email automation, right? It's like, you can see the job be done and then you follow the certain parameters behind it and the trust assumptions behind it. So that's kind of like my perspective.
But anything to add to this, or?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
I was just going to make a joke. AI can decide for the devs what they want. But yeah, I think like generally I completely agree with Jim. Like ultimately, devs should be choosing what's really best for their application, right? Like or their users basically, right? Like in the Web 2 world, for example, if someone is building an application, they have AWS and Google Cloud and Azure, and then within that there are like so many different configs to also choose from, right? What devs really chooses, what's really best for them, what are they most familiar with or comfortable with, and it's going to be pretty similar here as well. So any VM, any own app chain or like a generalized chain, everything kind of like depends on what's best for their use case.
Perfect.
I guess I have a controversial take here, which is I don't think applications will handle any of this in the long term. I think, especially with the rise of app rollups, which is probably going to become a thing in the next like 2 to 4 years, back to what Jim said, we're probably going to see most applications just live on one chain and just stay there. And the wider crypto space will probably just evolve around that. I think the two things that are probably coming to existence within the next 2 to 4 years that will solve that is definitely the first one being a universal token standard, some way to rest assured as a protocol of any kind on any rollup of choice to know that you're going to have access to all the assets and tokens that it's everywhere. And obviously there's sort of like guys like Polymer coming around, and I think Polymer can definitely extend the IBC sort of like token standards within the public to help with that. I think the other point is most chain abstraction will probably end up happening on a wallet level, simply because it just makes more sense for it to occur there. It's typically the case that users have dozens or hundreds of accounts across chains, and the people who are most aware of those accounts happen to be wallets, not applications. And so we're going to see most of the chain abstraction work happen on the wallet level and not on the application level. It's very possible in the next 2 to 4 years we don't really see much on the cross-chain application space at all, except if you're building maybe some general liquidity protocol or some general intent protocol. Most people will just be single chain.
Yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there. But as we move sort of towards wrapping up, I would love to hear your views on if we are in this world where we have incredible chain abstraction on the wallet, on the application level, where we have sort of Web 2 UX but with Web 3 security, what are some kind of applications that you would love to see built that are specifically multi-chain, or do you just hope that people will build app-specific things, and then if they need to interrupt, they can interrupt? So just show me what would you like to see built, so if there's any app developers in the crowd, they might get some inspiration.
Yeah, I think, funny enough, I actually don't really think about the ideal application of crypto being our general like application we have today. I think the ideal application for crypto, when everything is said and done, is probably going to be a bank. Imagine a world where you're walking around with a bank that lives entirely on crypto. I think that's probably the application that is most practical for most people around the world. And I think the biggest barrier to having that application right now is infrastructure just not being good enough to enable it. But once the infrastructure is good enough, we're definitely going to see full-blown crypto banks all over the place. And I'm pretty excited for that.
Jim, what do you want to see?
I want to see apps that help people. I want to see apps that are, it's hard for me to prescribe, right? If I were to prescribe, I'm not a very imaginative person, I'll probably just say a bank as well.
Bring back
no shade, it's actually a good answer. Had I gone first, I would have given that answer too. But I want to see apps that are like actually moving the needle for people's lives. And so when you look at crypto, and you look at like the two biggest use cases that have happened for like the 14 years of crypto, it is that it makes people money and that it makes people not lose money. And so in the first one, I mean, I don't need to, elaborate on how that's the case. But on the second piece, it's inflation hedge, right? And so having stable coins or having, store value assets as a way of helping people. And so the way in which that is kind of like encapsulated and like can be packaged to help people in different use cases needs to live within different like execution environments effectively. It needs to be optimized. It needs to have all these agents on top of it, ensuring that there's liquidity, there's price arbitrage is synchronizing all the different prices across all these different execution environments. And so once we kind of have all that in place, we can give these apps to these people and they can actually like feel benefit from what we're building.
Rashad and Sebastian will quite over time, I think. So very shortly, what do you want to see?
I'll keep it short, but like more theoretical. I think like Jim and Richard gave like extremely good examples. But the nerd in me says like I want to see some application which is like almost running on 5 different chains at once, basically, right? Like so a game where the gameplay is hosted on their own app roller, but the assets or NFTs or funds are on Ethereum and something else happens on something other chain, and everything is kind of like coordinated or like basically coordinated across these chains by the shared sequencer, which is like run by their own application, right? Like such a fancy ass application would be like great experiment in such a world.
I think that was said perfectly. That's what I was going to kind of allude to as well. I think that one of the most interesting things is chain agnostic applications. So applications that actually have workflows that exist across multiple chains. So they actually aren't bound to the confines of any single ecosystem or blockchain, but rather they exist simultaneously across 5, 10 blockchains. I think this is something that wasn't possible before necessarily to the same degree that it is now with chain abstraction. And I'm really excited for this future, especially with application level chain abstraction projects, like Socket, for example, and others. I think this is going to be one of the biggest unlocks for the ecosystem.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for listening.